Today we're going to learn how to name compounds. This subject is known as nomenclature, as in nomen, which means name. You can find this sheet in your packet that you'll find in the shared chemistry folder at this point. You can find your homework sheets as well. The system that we use for the three main types of compounds, ionic, covalent, and organic, are all different. We'll spend some time learning about the organic nomenclature later in the year, but today we're going to learn about ionic and covalent compounds, and we're going to focus specifically on ionic binary compounds, also covalent binary compounds. This means that there are only two different elements within the compound. Since the rules for naming compounds are different for ionic and covalent compounds, you're going to have to learn to tell the difference between the two. Actually, there's a fairly standard way of doing it, but we're not going to get into that right now. Instead, we're going to use this rule of thumb, which works pretty well most of the time. The rule of thumb that we're going to use is that if you have a metal and a nonmetal or a metalloid combined together, we're going to assume that that's going to form an ionic bond. If the compound is comprised of a nonmetal or a metalloid combined with another nonmetal or metalloid, we're going to assume that the compound is bound covalently. In the video you just watched, you saw how a sodium atom and a chlorine atom are able to combine together. The sodium atom loses one of its electrons and thereby becomes a positive sodium ion. The chlorine atom, in gaining an electron, becomes negatively charged, but instead of calling it a chlorine ion, we call it a chloride ion, having dropped the end of the chlorine and added the IDE ending. So now the name of our compound, NaCl, is sodium chloride. We see how this is an example of the rule for naming ionic compounds. The first thing we did is simply said the name of the positive ion, the sodium. Sometimes we need to add a Roman numeral to that. We're not going to worry about that at this point. Later, then we put the negative ion name, but as we saw, we chopped off the end of the name chlorine and added this IDE ending. Let's look at another example. The compound Na2O. Here we have the word sodium, and then we have oxygen, but again we'll cut off the name of the end of the compound, and now we call it oxide, as in sodium oxide. Let's see how the name of some of the other nonmetals and metalloids change their name. Repeat these after me. Carbon becomes carbide, nitrogen nitride, fluorine fluoride, phosphorus phosphide, sulfur sulfide, selenium selenide, bromine bromide, and iodine iodide. Part of your assignment is this worksheet, and all of these are binary ionic compounds of the type that you just learned about. So the first one, BaCl2, would be barium chloride. Now you do the rest of these. Covalent compounds have a similar naming scheme. You're still going to use this IDE ending. However, the compound name also includes information about the number of each type of atoms. You're going to have to learn these prefixes that tell you those numbers, as in 1 is mono and 6 as in hexa. You'll have to actually memorize these. Let's try some examples. We've seen these two compounds before. The first one called carbon monoxide, the second carbon dioxide, referring to the one oxygen and this other one with the two oxygens. Another one would be B2O3. With the 2 borons, we would call that diboron, and with the 3 oxygens, we would call that trioxide. Notice that we also, as part of the rule, have that if the first atom, the first element, only has 1, we drop the mono. Another part of your work involves doing this sheet, which actually continues on. You'll notice that you'll have to do both ionic and covalent compounds on this sheet. We're going to skip the Roman numeral part like before. Let's do the first one. Now remember, you have to decide first if you're going to use the ionic rule or the covalent rule. So in this case, we have sodium, which is a metal, and bromine, which is a nonmetal, bound together. That means we're going to assume that it's an ionic compound. Therefore, we'll use the ionic name sodium bromide, no mono or anything like that. In number 4, we see that we have sulfur, which is a nonmetal, combined with oxygen, which is also a nonmetal, so we'll assume this is covalent. Therefore, we use the covalent rules, which means we have to show that the oxygen has 2 members, so we would call that sulfur dioxide. Notice that some compounds that we've known about for a long time have common names. For example, the compound dihydrogen monoxide is commonly known as water, and the compound nitrogen trihydride is commonly known as ammonia. Well, that should do it. You can now start practicing on your own.